And you can begin whenever you are comfortable.
Set my screen up real quick. So please feel free as we go through today's training, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself at any time if you'd like to, or if you'd prefer to send it through the chat. You can also send it to me directly in the chat if you prefer for it to not come up in the recording and you still want to ask the question. So please feel free to utilize the technology however makes you feel comfortable today. So as I mentioned, my name is Kay Thomas. My pronouns are they and she. I am the clinical training manager for North County Lifeline's Project Life. For those of you who may not be as familiar with us, we are located, yes, in North County. However, our Project Life program and a couple of our other programs actually function throughout the entire county of San Diego. We are a completely mobile program in addition to providing remote services as well. We do a lot of different types of work and advocacy throughout the community. A couple of things I want to mention in particular, though, is that all of our services are completely free. We work with all ages, all genders, and all forms of trafficking, which is very unique in San Diego County. And our services are not time limited, meaning that folks can remain in services for as long as they'd like. We have an open door policy. So we have some folks, we actually are celebrating our 10th anniversary this month, which is really exciting. And we have some folks who have actually been involved in us with services since we started 10 years ago, who may, be in service with us for like a year or two, and then they will be all right. And then maybe something comes up and they need a little bit more support again. And so we have a completely open door policy, and we've seen many folks kind of come in and out as needed in different stages of their recovery and healing process. We do have a housing program up in North County that provides housing for up to 2 years, completely free. There's a fully furnished apartment. So they receive kind of they have the opportunity to kind of be set up in an apartment so they can basically explore what it would be like to live more independently. And it's a very independently based program in a housing first model. If you're interested in learning more about housing first, if you haven't heard that term before, we can definitely talk about that a little bit more later on as well. And then the last piece that I wanted to mention is we are one of 2 agencies in San Diego County who are on call for adult victims of human trafficking to the San Diego Human Trafficking Task Force. So we will go out and provide emergency response in the middle of the night. With the services that we offer to the folks that we work with, we offer intensive case management services, behavioral health therapy services, as well as trauma-specific treatment reprocessing. So if you have any questions about our trauma treatment models, feel free to reach out to me directly. I am one of the individuals who is trained in that, and I'm also one of the trainers for the institute that we do the training through, which is the Trauma Resource Institute. So feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about that. All right. So a couple things I want to do really quick before we get started today. I'm going to drop into the chat box. Or maybe I'm not. That's really unusual. Maybe I'm not going to drop it. I'll drop it in just a second. Yeah, there we go. Okay. I'm going to drop into the chat box in a moment a copy of the handouts so that you'll have a copy of the handout today. The exact same version is what I'm going to be going over today, just in case, so you're not furiously scribbling. But I do have a couple of things I want to point out to you. So the first is that on this very first slide is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out anytime. All of our training and technical assistance around human trafficking is grant funded and completely free. So if you have any questions about a case that you're working on, maybe you're not quite sure where you want to send a referral to, or you're not sure how to engage in the screening process, please reach out to us. We also offer free training on trafficking. So if you're like, hey, I really want to bring a training about working with men or LGBTQIA 2S+ folks, or I want to bring something around working with CSEC or former foster youth, please reach out to us. We can customize trainings. All of those components, again, are completely free. So please reach out if you need any assistance or help. And just a brief funding disclaimer that this training was produced through a grant through the Office for Victims of Crime through the Department of Justice. It doesn't specifically mean that the federal government agrees with anything I'm about to share with you. It just means they're signing my paycheck for the next 2 hours. They probably won't, because we're about to talk about law and policy, so they probably won't. And just a reminder as a content warning before we fully jump in, every time I do a training on human trafficking, It doesn't matter who the group of folks is. It doesn't matter who the professionals are. It doesn't matter what the topic is. This is a difficult thing for folks to talk about. We're talking about difficult content. We're talking about things that might be triggering something that you haven't thought of in 20 plus years in your own life. I literally just got off another training that I finished at 5:30 for our agency on an HT 102 training. And in that training, I had about 25 people. And at the end of the training, I had someone waiting for me to say, hey, I didn't realize until today that I had experienced labor trafficking at the hands of my parents as a child. And I was like, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's unpack that, right? And so I say that to say, please take care of yourself. This content triggers all sorts of things for folks. You're the most important part of this process. I love that people are eating because that totally keeps you grounded. So do what you need to do to care for yourself. So if you are not as familiar with North County Lifeline, I will just mention briefly, we are located up in North County. However, actually this year we started additional services aside from our Project Life program. We started additional services that were available throughout the entire county. So we actually have a new program called the Connections in Counseling program, which is working with homeless not foster youth, just homeless youth, period, throughout the county of San Diego in particular, working with youth who are houseless, whether they are actually living in the streets or they are experiencing family homelessness as well. Both of those are options. And then our Project Life program has always been throughout all of San Diego County. A lot of the services that we offer are actually based on early intervention and prevention-based work. This is an organization where we really believe in, kind of staying in that space upstream where we're trying to prevent people from falling into the river or pulling people out as quickly as we can before there's too much damage. And so a lot of the work we do is around early intervention and prevention and screening. We have many, many programs that are actually throughout the county in schools that are doing prevention and screening on suicidality, around mental health concerns, around learning disabilities, identifying youth as well as the families quickly to bring them the services that they need. We do a lot of work as well with first time reports of child abuse to the CWS system. So we will send a clinician into the home to do assessments to identify what is this family needing, what's missing here, and to help increase skills and communication, to increase support with the goal of keeping the family together. So a big part of the work we do is actually on that front end of that kind of prevention, early intervention based work. But then there's our Project Life program, which started 10 years ago. And so I've mentioned a couple of things that we do, but I do want to mention a little bit more about why we started 10 years ago. So we were actually established in 2011 as part of a community demand. The task force at the time did an operation at a hotel in Oceanside here in North County, and they recovered 35 local middle school girls who were experiencing trafficking starting in this hotel in Oceanside throughout the entire nation. And at that time, when this operation occurred, the task force came to us and said, well, y'all are actually working with some of these youth already. Remember, I told you we were doing prevention and early intervention based work. So we had identified there was something not quite right with some of these youth that was going on and that they needed additional support. And so as a result, the task force came to us and said, you're already providing services. Would you be willing to provide services for recovery and for healing? And we said yes. So 10 years ago, we said yes. And in true nonprofit, anti-trafficking fashion, we've been building the airplane that we've been flying ever since, which has been so much fun. And as a result, we have dramatically expanded and increased our services during that time. In particular, some areas that we specialize, as I mentioned, are working with men, boys, and LGBTQIA plus victims. I'm going to be talking about our LGBTQIA survivors and their experiences a little bit later on. But I did also want to mention that we offer things like prevention. So we work with a lot of the local prevention collective groups, doing prevention-based components within the schools, as well as doing community education and engagement and training for service professionals and providers. So let us talk about the LGBTQ2SIA plus communities. So before we jump in today, I'm going to be moving through this training under the assumption that folks have a very basic understanding of queer identities in the sense that you know what the letters mean. Do folks know what the letters mean? LGBTQIA 2S plus. I know you do, Denise. I know you do, Amy. You got me. Yeah, Anna. Yeah, girl. And it's okay if you don't. This is not a space for shame or judgment. This is a place to ask honest and open questions. I always make the joke amongst my friends and again the training community that I'm the safe queer to ask questions to. I don't get offended. It's okay if you want to ask me a question that you're like, I'm really not sure who to ask. It's okay to ask that question here. I
Hey,
saw
can
you
you talk
unmuted.
maybe a little about like two-spirit? I feel like that's kind of a lesser known part of the LGBT community.
Absolutely. So the two-spirit identity is actually rooted in the Indigenous and Native communities. So it's actually really interesting because we won't get too much into colonization and white supremacy in this moment. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later. But the reason why I mention that is because the 2S identity, the two-spirit identity is actually really specific. Excellent question, Amy. I'll get to that in just a moment. The two-spirit identity is actually specific to the Indigenous and Native populations. And so we have actually seen cultural co-opting of the two-spirit identity of folks who are white identifying using that. And so we always kind of want to shift people as a reminder. You can identify as non-conforming, gender non-conforming. You can identify as non-binary. You can identify as gender fluid. But two-spirit is a very specific identity that happens within Native and Indigenous communities. And it's often a designation that when folks end up, when they identify as that, those folks actually end up receiving special designation as healers within their communities, as religious, as individuals, as figureheads within their communities. So it's not just tied to the gender identity itself, it's also tied to a cultural and traditional practice within Native and Indigenous communities. So thank you so much for asking that question, Anna, because that is really specific to that group of folk. And then we have our non-binary, gender fluid, gender non-conforming, right? Someone who identifies as two-spirit may identify in that space of not identifying with either one of those binaries of the gender. They may identify as being non-binary or gender fluid. However, it's a very specific designation for that culture and that space. Fantastic question. And I've got another question. When is it okay to use the word queer? This is a good one. This is a hard one. So this one is really interesting because when we think about the word queer, right? For those of us who have maybe a little bit, have had a little bit more time on this earth, I know I look a lot younger than I am, but I even remember as a child hearing the term queer used as a derogatory term against myself or other people that I know. And so it's been really interesting to see in the last about 15 years or so, there's been this movement within the LGBTQIA 2S+ communities to say, we're going to reclaim this word and start to use this word and use this word in a way that's non-derogatory. And for many people, the term queer can kind of mean two different things. It could either mean someone who identifies as queer can be using that term as kind of an all-encompassing, I don't identify as heterosexual, or I don't identify as cisgender, or someone can be using the term queer to imply something very specific. For example, saying, I am gender queer means that I am gender fluid, I am non-binary, as an example. And so the queer word in and of itself is really interesting because it comes with a lot of conflict and historical tension associated with it. So here's what I always say. If someone does not identify themselves as queer, do not use the term queer. If they openly identify themselves as queer, I might refer to them as queer when I'm referring to them directly. If I'm referring to them out as with somebody outside of the community, so let's say I'm their therapist and I'm talking to somebody who is their doctor, right? I might say, oh, our trans client, our gay client, whatever, I may not use the word queer, depending on the environment. And it's not so much as kind of an in-group or an out-group component, so much as just wanting to ensure that we don't appear as though we're using the term derogatorily for folks who are outside of the community, if that makes any sense. I hope that makes sense how I explain that. I've heard people, yes, okay, excellent. I've heard people kind of try to compare it to the use of the N-word, and it's not the same at all. This is not something saying like you can or you can't have access to using this word, but we're changing the connotation behind it. And so sometimes we just have to be intentional about how we do that. And I've got some great questions about trauma work and being grounded while doing trauma work. And so I can definitely I'll bring that up towards the end as well. I'm just going to write myself a note. especially with the LGBTQIA community. There's a lot of things to consider within these communities around trauma and how that impacts them directly from the clinical space. So I will make sure that I mention that. Go back to the question. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Please ask any questions as they come up for you. Throw them in the chat, whatever makes sense for you. We're going to base this today. We're going to explore through the social ecological model. And here's why. We all lead intersectional lives. Every single one of us has these multiple identities that come to the table, right? I'll use myself as an example. I am a biracial individual. I am a non-binary individual. I am a pansexual individual. I am white presenting and white passing. I am heterosexual presenting and heterosexual passing sometimes. I can be, I'm not really currently, but I can be cisgender passing and presenting if I wanted to, in theory. I have all of these identities that I just shared with you, and many of them are marginalized, but they don't all come forward at the same time. I also have identities of being a natural US born citizen. That's a privilege that I hold. I have the privilege of being a native English speaker. I have the privilege of having a master's degree. And so these are all, again, examples of identities that I hold. But one of the reasons why we talk about this from the social ecological model is because when we don't acknowledge all the different ways that these different identities are impacted by all of these systems that we interact with on a regular basis, sometimes it can make it really difficult for us to think of solutions to problems that are really going to help the population we're working with. Sometimes when we don't think about this from a social ecological model of all of these nested systems that impact one another, we think about it from the perspective of this one individual is not doing the work that they need to do because they're lazy, because they're drinking, because they're this, because they're that, right? Maybe we make excuses for the behavior, or maybe we even place judgment on them because of the behavior. And so one of the reasons why we're using the social ecological model today is to show how, as we go through these nested systems, each one of these impact the LGBTQIA community in a different way and create these different ramifications for their lives, difficulties within their lives, and in particular, impact how they experience trafficking and exploitation. So let's start first by talking about the big one, the policy one, right? That's the big red one around the outside. So when we're thinking about policies or enabling environments, right, what we're thinking about is we're thinking about what are the national, state, or local laws that maybe are perpetuating marginalization or different forms of aggression. So I mentioned this on here. I put these on here because 2021 has actually been a record-breaking year for anti-trans legislation throughout the nation. The last time I looked it up, it's been a couple of months. I actually stopped checking the number of bills that were being introduced because it was starting to feel a little bit defeating to me. But the last time I looked to see, there were in July, over 100 bills that had been introduced across various state legislature platforms to restrict trans rights in particular in 2021. In July, there were over 200 bills that had been introduced at state legislature across the nation to restrict LGBTQIA community rights. This is really important. A lot of times, especially because we see a lot of visibility on shows like Pose or things like RuPaul's Drag Race, right? We see the commodity and the commoditization of gay and queer culture, of trans culture on a very regular basis. We see that it's become entertaining. We see that it's become easily accessible to many, many people. And while that's a wonderful thing, at the same time, what that does is it creates a very false narrative around equality and equity. It creates this idea that because I can see trans people on my screen, like Janet Mock as an example, or Laverne Cox, as an example, because I can see them and there's that visibility and that representation, that must mean that things are much better than they were, or that things are continuing to get better. Yes and no. Things may be better than they were to an extent. However, we still have many, many states in the US where it is not only, it is still considered potentially for you to be illegal if you are gay. It does not matter if that is not a federal law or not. That doesn't change what happens in the South. I personally grew up in the South in middle school and high school, and that was probably one of the scariest times for me to be alive, because I saw my friends go to conversion camps. I saw my friends commit suicide because of the trauma they had experienced. And so I say that to say, we often living in Southern California see a very different way of culture, but that's not necessarily the reality of the entire nation. So it's always important for us to kind of take that more global perspective when we're thinking about legislation and overall rights within the nation, especially for our clients, because they're not always living in San Diego or California, right? When they're first born, they may be coming from another environment. They may be coming from another state where this was their experience. And so as clinicians, it's really important that we have that understanding as well. So I did want to mention, I've seen, and I am not here to open a huge can of worms, but I did just want to put out there, I know in the HT community, we've been having lots of conversations about the SB 357 bill that was drafted this year. The controversy that went back and forth on both sides about who this bill was supposed to protect and what this bill was supposed to do. That bill was actually originally introduced because many trans people, and actually that the bill that it was essentially attempting to target was the Walking While Trans bill, because there are many laws on the books that basically allow police officers to stop folks without due course. And so that's why this SB 357 bill was initially being introduced, to say you can't just stop someone without due cause to say that they are engaging in solicitation. Previously, we had even seen officers utilize things like an unopened condom as a means to say this person, this trans woman, was attempting to sell sex. Well, if you don't know much about trans culture, I'll just start by saying lots of trans folks, first of all, only go out at night. That's a real common thing. Why? Because you can pass easier at night, because you get harassed less often at night. If you are somebody who cannot pass for the gender that you identify with, you are frequently called out. There may even be aggression that you experience if you're walking around in your community during the daytime in broad daylight. So many trans folks actually are only out at night. That's a really common thing. They'll work at night, right? Maybe in the restaurant industry or the bar industry or other places, but they're more often than not, they're out at night. So there's one thing, right? So police officers are already making a really specific assumption just because someone is out at night that they might be engaging in illicit activity. Many people who are in the trans community carry around various forms of barrier methods of contraception of different kinds with them on a regular basis. That's not an uncommon thing. There are lots of folks who are trans who are moving from house to house, who may be more transient. There are lots of folks who are in the queer community in general that are just trying to practice safe harm reduction policies around sexual interactions. And fortunately, though, when this SB 357 bill was introduced to the floor, there was a lot of really interesting controversy from both sides. But one of the reasons why I bring this up in particular is because while the SB 357 bill may not have been the most effective way to address the issue that was at hand, what it brought up was the reality that many folks within the anti-trafficking movement are not paying attention to how these laws impact the LGBTQIA community. Many folks within the anti-trafficking movement are seeing this issue as a cisgender heterosexual issue, and that is not the case, unfortunately. So when we think about all of these laws, right, all of these different laws that we have on the books or things that we're attempting to change, why is this important? Well, because many trans people, when they see those laws that might be on the books that are limiting the bathroom they can use, that are limiting their name, that are limiting their access to a shelter. Remember, we're going to talk more about shelter and sex segregation in a moment. But in particular, when we see these laws on the books, that doesn't make someone who is trans or queer identifying feel comfortable asking police for help. In fact, there are many studies that indicate that many folks within the LGBTQIA+ community experience mistreatment, harassment, and discrimination at the hands of law enforcement in particular. When we think about LGBTQIA folks as well, unfortunately, they are also overrepresented in the legal system for prostitution related offenses. So again, we see folks who are being more targeted than others. We see that a trans woman is more likely to get that ticket for solicitation than a cisgender woman is. And that's important for us to keep in mind. Why do we see that one of these folks is more deserving of this legal ramification than the other? And how are we designating that this trans woman is not also experiencing exploitation versus the cisgender woman? How are we making that distinction? There's also in particular an actually increased risk of being labeled as a sex offender, not only prostitution related offenses, but being labeled as a sex offender. So again, that impacts where you can live, where you can work, if you could go back to school, right? That impacts your livelihood. There's actually a study that's done every 4 years, actually. Oh, we should have a new one coming out soon from 2020. Yes, or 5 years. It's called the US Trans, sorry, I love data. I find it to be so fascinating, especially about the queer community, because it's so hard for us to find data about ourselves. So it's always exciting when somebody's doing the work. But every 5 years or so, the US Transgender Survey happens, and it is a nationwide survey. The last one that happened was in 2015, and it was actually about 15,000 folks who participated on a nationwide level. So really, really big data set. And one of the things that survey found, that was 2015 when that survey came out. And one of the things that they found was that 33% of Black transgender women and 30% of multiracial transgender women had experienced police officers just assuming that they were sex workers off the bat, period, whether they had engaged or not. So again, already we see this implicit bias that comes into play because of the laws we have in place, how that perpetuates an enabling environment. That implicit bias continues to perpetuate. And because of that, we see that they are more likely to be harassed by police. That same study found, that 2015 US transgender study found that 86% of trans respondents reported that they had been harassed, sexually assaulted, attacked, or mistreated in some way by police. 86%. So let's take that one step farther. While these folks were in detention, so not necessarily that they were just walking by and maybe they heard a police officer say something and maybe they interpreted it as being harassed. This is literally them in detention. While in detention, 23% of them experienced physical assault by staff or other inmates. 20% of them experienced sexual assaults. And in particular, that makes transgender folks 5 times more likely to be assaulted by staff and 9 times more likely to be assaulted by other inmates. I've got a question about the name of the study. I actually have a copy of all of the references for you that'll be in the back of the presentation, but this one was the 2015 US transgender study that was done by James et al. I think it was published 2016 formally, if I remember correctly. So this is important for us to keep in mind, right? Again, this legal system continues to make options smaller and smaller and smaller and more scarce for the folks who are experiencing this. When we think about, so that's adults. Let me tell you about youth for a minute. When we think about youth that are being arrested, they are more likely to be arrested, charged, and incarcerated than their non-LGBTQ peers. And in particular, there was one study that found that LGBTQ youth are more often detained for nonviolent offenses, like being homeless or out of home placement, as compared to their non-LGBTQ peers. So again, we're seeing a bias in their youth already. In addition to that, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that when youth are LGBTQIA 2S plus identifying, they're often being placed and they're often being screened as being high risk, right? We all know, we're all in the HT community and can say, oh, LGBTQIA youth are way higher risk for experiencing trafficking. We know that. They're higher risk for bullying. We know that, right? But what happens is that places like Polinsky, as an example, or other detention facilities will say, we're going to isolate this youth for their safety. Y'all, we've been going through a pandemic for the last 1.5 years. I don't know about you, but my mental health is real squirrely some days because of isolation. And I am not a youth and I am not in detention. Isolation is not healthy for anyone. We are social beings. And so I say that to say, it's really important that we acknowledge the ways that in an attempt to keep our youth safe from a legal perspective, we actually isolate them and insulate them even more. Lastly, our youth of color are highly overrepresented within the system, specifically within our LGBTQ youth in the court system in particular, in addition to the reality that we see much higher rates of sexual assaults at 12.5% versus their non-LGBTQ peers at 1.3% in detention facilities and correction facilities. So again,
Kay, can you tell us, like, just as a point of reference, what's the demographic just in the general population in comparison to what they are in the juvenile detention?
The number of LGBTQIA youth, we're actually going to get to that in just a moment. I actually have some California specific statistics that we're going to look at. So yes, we're going to be there in a minute. Yeah. Oh yes, I got you. So let's take a look at some organizational vulnerabilities now. So we're going to go one more in, right? Our organizational vulnerabilities, we're thinking about organizations and social institutions. So we're thinking about, what does this look like with services in the community? What does this look like with this relationship, not only with social institutions like schools and things like that, but also how these laws are impacting these environments. So again, let's take a look at some organizational vulnerabilities for our LGBTQIA youth. So they're actually, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, just briefly, they're less likely to receive assistance when they are working with providers for housing in both short-term and long-term than their non-LGBTQ peers. What we're seeing here in this organizational space is an implicit bias, right? That's trickling down slowly from the law into a space of, now this is what's happening. The law says, here's who is allowed to have housing, and we're going to give that funding out to community. And then the community says, here's how we're going to disperse that based on what we think our program should look like. But when we have these implicit biases, we miss a whole chunk of people. In addition to that, we know that oftentimes they don't seek services just because they literally don't know that they exist. There may not be services specifically for them, but they may also not be aware of what could be available to them. We see this on a really regular basis when we're doing outreach. We talk about things like OSP, Our Safe Place, which is the LGBTQIA drop-in center, youth drop-in center in North County, Central, and South Bay. And we talk about those types of places on a regular basis, and youth will say, like, I had no idea that was a thing. Yeah, it's okay. Let me take you. Let me show you. Let's get connected, right? But these are things that, again, they may not be aware of. We talked briefly about this, but I'm going to bring this up now, talking about sex segregated services in shelters. So just for a federal law moment, VAWA, the Violence Against Women's Act, that's been reauthorized 1.5 million times, thankfully. I mentioned VAWA because actually under VAWA, it specifically states that a person's stated gender is the only requirement for someone to access shelter. And yet I see Kristen is like, yes, I see your face. You're like, yep. But here's the thing though, right? Most shelters are sex segregated. And someone will say, hi, my name's Mary. And they'll say, Mary, what's your gender? And she'll say, I'm a female. And they'll say, Mary, your voice is kind of low. And, oh, it's because I'm trans, girl. It's okay, right? Mary's trying to keep it light because she's trying to get the services that she needs. But then Mary starts to they ask her questions like, well, Mary, have you had your transition surgery yet? Yeah, I've had my top surgery. Okay, but have you had your bottom surgery? We can't place you with another female if you haven't had your bottom surgery yet. First of all, under federal law, all of this is illegal, first of all. However, the reality is what's happening, again, because we have these state legislative systems and that implicit bias moving in, the way that folks get screened, the beliefs that people have about what is a real woman or what is a real man or what gender truly is versus sexuality versus sexually deviant behavior, which, by the way, isn't even on the same page. It's not even the same book. It's somewhere completely different. Those all get convoluted together. So we see many youth in particular not being able to access services because they say, well, I identify as non-binary. I don't identify as male or female. And so they say, well, you have to pick. Well, I'm just going to choose to be homeless then. We have other situations where we have service providers, of course, engaging in discrimination. But in addition to that, what that US transgender survey that I was mentioning earlier, that James et al., the one that, the one that Amy put in the link, that one in particular reported 70% of the respondents who stayed in a shelter, the youth in the past year, had experienced some form of abuse, mistreatment, or harassment specifically due to being transgender. So we see that shelter services and spaces are really not safe for trans folk. So when we see trans and non-binary people out there in the streets that are homeless, and maybe we make an implicit bias judgment and say, well, there's all of these shelters available, they're choosing this for themselves. Are they really? When we turned the conference center last year into the makeshift space for folks who are houseless, we had many transgender clients who came to us and said, I went there in an attempt to seek housing and safety and socially distance, and I was sexually assaulted. I was verbally assaulted. I was verbally harassed. I felt unsafe. Things were stolen from me, and I left. I'd rather be on the street. I'd rather get COVID. And we saw that happen with some of our trans clients. And so this is important for us to keep in mind, because when we're not thinking about how these policies and enabling environments are impacting our organizational components, we're missing really vital services for folks. So thinking about other vulnerabilities, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, I think it's on the next one is where we're going to talk about incarceration rates. But specifically, so these numbers here are for the state of California. In particular, looking at school systems, right? We see a lack of LGBTQIA safe housing. We see a lack of culturally responsive housing and supportive services for queer trafficking survivors in particular. We have actually had, especially some of our male survivors who identified as gay or bisexual, have shared with us that they've literally been chased out of organizations. You are a male, you don't belong here at all. Not even remotely able to acknowledge that they may have experienced some form of victimization. We also see as well our non-binary and our trans clients often being moved to other spaces because, oh, well, our female clients don't feel comfortable with you in that space, as opposed to us engaging in the real conversation that we're supposed to as mental health providers, which is based in social justice and equity. So thinking about this in particular, this was from 2019. I'm sure that these numbers are going to shift and change. They are actually in the process of doing new data and research on this, but the pandemic has really radically shifted how youth are even able to engage right now. So I'll be curious to see what this looks like. But before, when youth were in school, this was a little bit of a snapshot of what they were experiencing from an interpersonal level, right? In school, right? They were saying that many of them, specifically 36% of LGBTQ youth in California, they rate coming out to their parents as extremely stressful. In addition to that, we see only 21% of them are out to their parents. That's a huge number that are under the radar right now. And that's okay, they're allowed to be. That's a huge number of youth who aren't openly identifying and we're potentially marginalizing as service providers. 29% of them talked about being taunted or mocked by their parents or family members for being LGBTQ, right? So we're seeing how kind of this space is existing within the community of what they're seeing around them. We also know that when we look specifically at school-based policies, that almost 60% reported experiencing policies that they may have received disciplinary action for, like public displays of affection. Attempting to wear clothing, that was at 28% experienced disciplinary action for public displays of affection to their partner. 18% were prohibited from wearing clothing to school that was deemed inappropriate due to their gender assigned at birth. 17% of them were prohibited from discussing LGBTQ topics in assignments, and 16% were prohibited from even talking about it in extracurricular activities. So we're not even getting any credit for this. This is something we're doing in our free time. 3% in the state of California. In the state of California, 3% reported being disciplined solely for identifying as LGBTQ in their school systems. 22% of them were prevented from using their chosen name or pronoun as trans or gender nonconforming youth. And then lastly, 28% of trans and gender nonconforming youth were required to use a bathroom or locker of their legal sex as opposed to the bathroom or their locker room they identified with. So again, we're seeing how this all trickles down into these different spaces, right? So now we've moved from the policy to the organization to the community to the interpersonal space. So thinking about the interpersonal space in particular, I am really hoping that those numbers are on here. If they're not, I'm just going to write down those detention numbers just in case, because I know I have those on a different slide right next to me if I need them, just in case I don't have them. So thinking about the interpersonal vulnerabilities, right? So we moved from the space of the law to how that helps create implicit bias within organizations, which reinforces prejudice and marginalization within community spaces. And now we're to the interpersonal, we're to the individual vulnerabilities or the interpersonal space, right? So thinking about the interpersonal space in particular, these are some really difficult numbers. And so if you are someone who identifies within the queer community, I encourage you to take a moment to take a sip of your water if you have it. To unclench your jaw. Ooh, maybe stretch your neck, drop your shoulders back. So these numbers, the Walter Chen and breeding numbers, these are actually CDC numbers from 2013. So this is a CDC study that was done at the top. The CDC has not updated these numbers yet. We're hoping that this will be in the next year or two that we'll see another study happen on a similar scale. But this was one of the first times that we really saw the CDC even collecting data of this kind in the LGBTQIA plus community. And this is really interesting because there's this really interesting conversation about many schools and actually many states not even wanting to collect this kind of data whatsoever. So we often have a very difficult time talking about what the experiences of the queer community looks like because legislation prevents that data from being gathered in that way. It has to often be done independently or privately funded. So this is one of the few examples where we've seen federally the government saying, we want to know what's going on. We want to know what's happening for folks. So these are some pretty staggering numbers, right? 44% of lesbian women, 61% of bisexual women, 26% of gay women, and 37% of bisexual men will experience rape, intimate partner violence, stalking, and or stalking by a partner in their lifetime. So as you can see, the numbers for folks who identify as bisexual. And so when we say bisexual, we kind of mean the bi plus spectrum, right? So that might be people who identify as bisexual, people who identify as pansexual, maybe people who identify as demisexual. As an example, there's a lot of folks who fall under that bi plus category, but I say that to say folks who fall under the bi plus spectrum literally are just attracted to more than one gender. That's the easiest way to put it. Having said that, though, you will see that folks in this bi plus spectrum are actually the highest risk for experiencing sexual violence for many reasons. First and foremost, because of state and national laws, right? When we think about, again, how all of these things help influence implicit bias and move us to different spaces, there are a couple of things. The FBI did not actually change their federal definition of rape until the year 2013 to remove the term of vaginal penetration as being the required element for rape. They did not actually expand that to be encapsulated for all genders until 2013, which is again when this study came out. The FBI changed the definition, and then we started with this study because we wanted to see what was happening. And so the reason why I mention that is because what we see for many bisexual men and women is that they often experience something called corrective rape. Corrective rape meaning from both heterosexual and non-heterosexual folks, you haven't found, let's say you're a female, you haven't found the right man yet. So I'm going to sexually assault you to show you what a good time you can have. I'm gonna fix it for you. We also see that on the other side, though, within the queer community, because relationship violence doesn't discriminate based on your sexual orientation or your gender identity. We know that. It doesn't discriminate based on anything. And so we also see in the queer community people saying, well, you're not really bi, you're a lesbian, and I'm going to show you that you're only attracted to women, right? And so we see these folks experiencing pain and victimization on both sides. We see in the transgender community in particular, our trans and gender nonconforming folks have some of the highest risk for violence, experiencing sexual assaults, intimate partner violence, and in particular, 10% reporting physical violence from a family member due to their identity, no other reason. We also know when we think about the LGBTQIA interpersonal experience in general, that folks are more likely to have experienced child abuse, including sexual abuse at 32% and physical abuse at 58% than their non-LGBTQ peers at 16% and 47% respectively. We know that with young men who have sex with men, that they are actually more likely to both experience intimate partner violence, and they are 5 times more likely to be forced to have sex with their partner. They're also, gay men in particular, are 7.4 times more likely to experience sexual violence. Lastly, we also know, and right, we're talking about trafficking today and exploitation. So we know that young men who have sex with men are at 22% more likely to be forced into prostitution than other young men at 6%. So we see these really high staggering rates. We see youth being removed from their home for neglect. We see them being twice as likely to have a history of homelessness. And while we know that many of our queer youth may be twice as likely to run away from home, we also know that they're up to 7 times more likely to engage in survival sex, which is a huge concern, right? Because we think about the risks associated with survival sex, especially for a minor, regardless of their identity, especially for a minor. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that spectrum and what I'm going to refer to as the range of consent in a moment. So let's look one more nested piece here in the very middle, the individual. So we've seen all these nested impacts kind of trickling down, cascading down. So what does this look like from an individual vulnerability perspective? Well, we know that sexual minorities are twice as likely to have been or to not be insured, right? So if somebody's not insured, that really impacts their access to services, impacts their access to their well-being. In particular, though, some of the things that we want to think about are that they're also more likely to have mental health disorders. So if someone is 2 times more likely to have mental health disorders for all the reasons we just talked about, right? I don't know how you could not. For all those reasons, where are they actually receiving any sense of treatment, any sense of support if they're potentially uninsured? If their providers are not culturally responsive? If the services have completely written them out because they don't fit into a neat little gender box? We see that these folks in particular are more likely to have all sorts of issues with depression, anxiety, substance use, suicidality throughout their life. In addition to that, we see that from a poverty perspective, right, 27% of LGBTQ folks are experiencing food insecurity, and 25% of them make less than the poverty line, which is $24,000 a year. So a quarter of folks in the queer community are below the national poverty threshold. They're actually 2 times more likely than the national average, 29% versus 12%.
Is that because of employment opportunities and discrimination?
Yes. So the employment in particular, actually, that was one of the next things I was going to talk about. Employment and unemployment in particular is actually 3 times higher than the national average at 15% for the queer community in particular. So of course, right, that feeds into that component, but in addition to the workplace treatment component. So not only are they more likely to be unemployed, but in the workplace, they're more likely to be report like being fired or denied a promotion or experiencing like some form of mistreatment because of their gender expression or identity at 30%. And then in addition to that, when we add housing onto that component, which is a whole nother level, yes, absolutely. Part of working in this community is 100% activism. You're so right about that, Coletta. And this is the thing, right, is that when we come to the table and we talk about human trafficking, regardless of the community that we're working with, we are working towards equity and justice. We're not working towards passing laws. We're not working towards just creating services. We're working towards justice for everyone. And when we take and we come behind ourselves and we pull the people who are the most marginalized, services for every survivor improves. Services for every community improves. And so you're absolutely right. This is This is being an activist in this space as well. It's not just about saying, hey, I'm here to provide you with some mental health services. It's so much more than that. And sometimes that's helping that person identify the activism within themselves, where they need to maybe be a better advocate for themselves or find people who can be good advocates for them. So the housing piece though, right? So let's go back again with this poverty component, right? So we have either unemployment or difficulty gaining employment or maintaining employment. Actually, during the pandemic, we've seen this really interesting, I haven't actually talked about this before. We've seen this really interesting shift where we've seen many of our trans folks who are documented, not our undocumented folks, but our documented folks are able to get a job because the interviews are over the phone and through Zoom. But then as soon as they show up to sign that HR paperwork, all of a sudden, oh, there's a hiccup in funding. Oh, the position's no longer available. Oh, it's already been filled. Oh, we've got to pull it for fiscal reasons, right? And so there's all of these reasons why they're rescinding that offer. Now, you or I, who, you know, I see myself as a pretty decent advocate for my own well-being. Well, sometimes I see myself as an okay advocate for myself, right? If that had happened to me, I probably would have been like super upset. And after maybe a couple of days of mourning or grieving or processing, I would be like, all right, time to call a lawyer, right? But the reality is that you see already how much the legal system has negatively impacted this community, how much service providers and the law and justice have been vacant in these people's lives. And so their belief in the legal system to have any sense of meaningful change for their life is often very minimal, in addition to the fact that they may not have access to the resources to pay for that. From a housing perspective, 33% of LGBTQIA plus folks will experience homelessness in their lifetime. Many of my friends who were queer identifying experienced homelessness sometime in their late teens or their early 20s. And that's just a very common experience for folks. And 23% of people who were homeless said that they experienced discrimination housing practices in the past year while they were attempting to gain housing due to their gender identity or expression. The last piece that I want to mention from here as well is that 61% of trans folks who engaged in commercial sex work had experienced employment discrimination prior to them engaging in sex work. This is really important for us to keep in mind, because as we see, sexual minorities are less likely to be employed, they have greater likelihoods of substance use, and they're more likely to commit suicide. All of these things continue to play into this really specific and interesting implicit biases that we have. And one of the things I want to talk about today is how recruitment is often different for this community. Recruitment, not always, but often, is actually often based in a space of survival. How many of you have seen the show Pose? If you haven't, you should put it on your watch list. So if you haven't seen the movie Pose, I'll just give you a very, very brief idea. The show Pose is about the houses in New York City, the ballroom scene where Vogue started, right? You might know Madonna and Vogue, right? That came from the ballroom scene, the queer scene, specifically the drag, non-binary scene in New York City. Pose, the show, is about that experience. It's about that space. It's about the evolution of that culture. And something that we saw, not just then, but we also see now, is that we'll see queer folk often come together and create their own houses or their own chosen family, where there might be 4 or 5 queer folk living together, and they're pooling their resources to pay rent, to pay for food, to pay for gas, right? And so something that we see often happen in that space is maybe there are queer youth who are homeless, who are taken in by someone as basically like a mentor, right? That queer youth will come into the house, and the person, maybe the house mom, will say, hey, everybody's responsible who lives here for paying $300 in rent every month. That's just a deal, $300 in rent, right? House mom is not saying, hey, you should go have sex with people for money. House mom is not saying, hey, I know a trafficker, or hey, I'll be your pimp or facilitator. House mom is just saying, everybody's got to pay $300 to make rent every month. That's how it works here. If you want to sleep on the couch, You got to pay $300 in rent. So this is where this range of consent comes into play. We oftentimes in the human trafficking movement have a tendency to think about things in very black and white terms, right? It's good, it's bad, it's trafficking, it's not trafficking, it's exploitation, it's not exploitation. But here's the reality, is that there's a range within sex work of people being fully empowered and engaging in sex work, doing all sorts of stuff on their own terms, in their own space, in their own way, to people being severely trafficked and exploited and marginalized. It's a very wide range. And it's important for us to keep in mind this wide range because oftentimes when we're talking about the LGBTQ community, they're kind of in the middle of that range. And this is why we miss them on a regular basis. So thinking about it from this perspective, right? I am a 17-year-old youth. I am non-binary. I came out to my parents. My parents kicked me out for my gender identity. They told me it was sinful. They told me they never want to see my face again. I'm now homeless. I went to Hillcrest because I know that's the neighborhood and there are people that look like me or people that I want to be like. So I'm going to head to Hillcrest. And someone says to me, hey man, if you have sex with me, I'll let you stay on my couch for the next 2 weeks. Well, I don't want to be homeless. And I'd rather have a place to stay, right? So I engage in survival sex. At this moment, I'm 17. I am considered to be a victim of CSEC. I'm exchanging a sexual act for a commercial good or to meet a basic need of some kind. But now let's fast forward 3 weeks when I turn 18. I'm still the same kid I was 3 weeks ago who was homeless and kicked out of my house because I was non-binary, but now I'm not considered a victim of human trafficking. Now I'm considered to be engaging in sex work of my own volition. Now I'm seen as by service providers as choosing this. But 3 weeks ago, I was a CSEC victim.
That seems like a really gray area.
Yeah. And so that's the important piece, is that when we put these really specific boxes around service provision, as an example, when we completely eliminate whole groups of people. So for example, with our program, one of the ways that we tackle this issue is we have lots of trans folk who, let's say they're in their 30s, their 40s, even their 50s, and they experience CSEC. That was part of their victimization. And so we say, you experienced trafficking, you experienced exploitation. Now, maybe you did engage in sex work throughout your life to meet your basic needs. And maybe we do have to figure out, right, how to help you undo some of those legal ramifications and those different components. But the reality is that you wouldn't be this far down the stream if somebody had pulled you out upriver. You wouldn't be in this river to begin with if someone hadn't pushed you in up at the top, right? And so that's how we have to start the process of reframing. We have to start to reframe it and say, okay, how are my eligibility criteria for my program maybe preventing me from providing the services to people who are falling through the cracks, right? Like that youth who just turned 18. I think about eye care as a perfect example because their services, right, are expanded beyond the age of 18. And so folks can come into that space and they don't have to identify as a survivor of anything, right? But they can come into that space, they can share their experience, right? And they can still get services. But many times what we see happening, so not specifically speaking to eye care or San Diego Youth Services because they do a phenomenal job, but thinking about maybe some of the other spaces that only serve adult survivors as an example, and them saying, well, you haven't experienced trafficking as an adult, so we're not going to help you.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
And I want to echo that hard because I know exactly what you're talking about in some different services in San Diego County. And that is a huge barrier because when we talk about re-traumatization, right? And then we say, okay, baby, like, you know, this is what you need. Let's see, we're not a housing support navigator, but we will help you. So let's go to the plugs that got it made, right? So we go to them. And then that's the question that they ask. Are they a victim of human trafficking? Yes, they are, but they want the documentation. They want the citation number. They want the police report. They want it to be on paper. And if they don't meet the criteria. And so that is, you know, that's a huge disappointment because it's, where is that area of gray? Where do we go to? Who can we lean on if we're not able to provide, you know, everything, but there's other programs that are designed for those reasons, and we can't lean on them for that part, because we've got to ask them, hey baby, what was that police report, you know, do you remember when you were 14? Let's see if, like, go to the juvenile courts and see if we're not going to go through all of that again. And number one, they should not be asked for that all over again. You know, it's like, I think that there needs to be a more understanding of collaborative work when it comes to our clients, because take us for word when we say they are, you know, we would not be coming to you if it wasn't a high needed situation, right?
Ooh, Denise, you're speaking my language, girl. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And see, here's the thing though, right? Like, if you don't have that police report and you are a trans person, what's the likelihood that you even bothered to report that in the first place? Because trans folks were going to say, oh, well, you're just a prostitute and you deserved what you got. That wasn't trafficking. That wasn't exploitation. That wasn't sexual assault, right? If they even take the report in the first place. And I think in addition to that, one of the things that you're bringing
right,
up,
or was the police report, or was the incident not recorded as such? Was it recorded for truancy? Was it recorded for trolley dipping? Was it recorded for, you know, all that, you know?
Absolutely. And I think the other piece that you're speaking to, right, is the space of when you're reaching out to other service providers and looking for that, and they're saying, do you have that certification, right? We know that many of our LGBTQIA, especially our trans, our gender diverse folks, are most likely not going to have that documentation because they don't feel safe going to them. But in addition to that, if we're looking at this from an intersectional component and adding also their documentation status onto that, which is also another part in and of itself, which we don't even have the time to get into today entirely, but folks who are trans and undocumented, the last 4 years, if you're not aware, the last 4 years, the last administration really screwed things over with T visas. They set things up so that if you applied for a T visa and you are on any kind of government assistance whatsoever, your application was denied. End of story.
Right.
Because you have to prove that you can support yourself in the US before you're allowed to stay here. So how is an undocumented trans person supposed to do that? How is an undocumented trans person able to truly get to that space where not only are they able to be certified as a victim, but they're even able to make ends meet long enough to put a T visa through so that they can legally work here? It's absurd. And so I really appreciate your point, Denise, because I think it also brings up the component, as you mentioned, of the need for us to be collaborative. And the, how am I going to say this? The red tape. Yes, red tape, but I think there is an unhealthy paranoia in the anti-trafficking community sometimes. And don't get me wrong, I understand why it exists, but there's often a lot of jockeying for positioning and for like recognition. And I understand the politics and the things that go on with that. But in particular, how I see that happening between service provider relationships is that people don't trust each other. You're trying to take advantage of me. You're trying to take my resources. You're trying to do this. You're trying to do that. As opposed to, how do we reframe that the whole reason we got into this work, or should be the whole reason we're in this work, is for the folks that we're serving. It's not about my ego. It's about helping this person get a safe place to stay tonight. And so how do we shift how we have conversations with each other as service providers to move away from this space where we have to have a service provider that maybe even is someone we know and trust? Yes. There's way more than enough work for everyone. I always say that jokingly. I'm like, I've got job security. I mean, this is hard work. There's always something for everyone to do and a new angle to take. And so I think that's really important for us to consider. So yes, right. Back to this range of consent. What does all this mean? I'm almost done today, folks, I promise, but please keep throwing in questions if you have any questions in the chat box. So thinking about the range of consent, right? We've got to move back to this space of acknowledging if there are minimal opportunities for legal work, if there are maximum experiences of marginalization, of discrimination, of folks being fired or not being hired or not being provided services because of their LGBTQIA 2+ identity, 2S+ identity, then we have to consider this range of consent as the reality of some of our clients, and that some of them are going to engage in sex work to meet their basic needs. And so how do we ensure that we're shifting how we do our services, how we do our outreach, how we provide services to also meet the needs of folks? So one of the things I want to mention in particular about recruitment, I mentioned briefly before a little bit about recruitment from the perspective of that teenager, right? Who they're maybe they are have a math teacher who approaches them and says, hey, if you give me a blowjob, I'll give you an A on your test instead of a B, right? So we see peers or adult customers often approaching our LGBTQIA folk more frequently in a different way. It is not uncommon for a queer person who is an adult to be approached and propositioned for sex on a regular basis, just going out to a bar. And this isn't necessarily other queer people coming up to you. It's often people who are kind of, I don't even remember the term that we use, but basically they're like tourists. They're like coming down from Chula Vista up to Hillcrest to pick up somebody for the night, right? It's not somebody who's really part of our community necessarily, but they're coming into these spaces predatorily. We've seen this on quite a unfortunately sharp increase in San Diego. We've had quite a few drug facilitated sexual assaults in our bars over the last couple of months in particular around some of these issues. So we're attempting to address those in the best way that we can. And then there was one national study that I want to mention that found 77% of LGBTQIA adults that had engaged in sex work had experienced CSEC prior to the age of 18. So how are we asking the question about victimization? How are we asking them about their experience, and how are we defining eligibility is really where I want to go back to over and over again. So force, fraud, and coercion, other things that might differ. We see some traffickers might use their identity as a way to provide a sense of like belonging. Oh, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to love you. I'm going to keep you here. And that is often sometimes difficult for youth who maybe they didn't have that experience previously. And so it really creates this sense of complication and betrayal, right? It's that trauma bond coming in. This is my family that loves me and cares about me. I can't turn them into the police. I can't tell my counselor what's going on. This is not safe for me because this is my safe place. I can wear what I want here. I can do what I want here. We also see that traffickers in particular are often targeting youth who have a lack of a strong support network. So maybe they have those commercial goods or material needs, as well as having those financial strains, and that maybe they've experienced specifically that they're also scanning for folks who have experienced violence or a strong sense of marginalization in the past to tap into those feelings of marginalization and rejection. The other piece that I'll mention, of course, traffickers normalize sexual behavior as part of being gay. That's a really big one. This is just what we do in our community. Why not charge for it? That's not what we do in our community. But the last one I want to mention, which is actually one that's really difficult on a regular basis, is that not just trans youth, but trans folks in general, they may be required to work for their hormones or their medical needs that are related to their gender identity. So someone might get paid in testosterone, in street testosterone, in street estrogen. They might pay for someone to have a street transition surgery of some kind. I've seen folks have full-on facelifts in people's kitchens or bottom surgery in someone's garage. So this is important for you to keep in mind, especially as a medical provider, that folks may have gone to a non-reputable space to receive some type of medical treatment, and that sometimes there's complications. Yes, they absolutely can. I love the gender affirming clinic. Bix is one of my heroes. They're fantastic. But so I say that to say though, right? As medical providers, we also have to add that additional assessment in. Are there potential medical concerns now? Some of the clients that we've worked with in the past, especially who have come from more of the global South, so Central and Southern America, have engaged in body modification through things like using caulking to give themselves cheek fillers. Caulking does not stay where you put it. So what ends up happening is all of that caulking turns into one big mass, and now they have this giant chemical mass moving around, which causes cancer and all sorts of other tumors and physical health issues. So really important to keep in mind. Again, we are only asking questions when we have a need to know them, remember, but we're engaging in potentially some additional assessment because this is important for these folks. So some other barriers to service for you to keep in mind as you're thinking about how you might be expanding services and how you might be moving towards other spaces is service provider discrimination. We've talked about a lot, right? How can you engage in additional training for your staff, for yourself, for your exploration? Something that I frequently share with folks is when you are in a training, I mean, maybe it's my training today, maybe it's another training, but when you're in a training and something comes up that you're like, oh, I didn't like how that felt. Write that down. Pay attention to it. We don't grow when we're comfortable. We don't. Humans don't. So if we don't grow when we're comfortable, it's really important for us to pay attention to things that feel icky or a little uncomfortable to us so we can explore that for ourselves. So if there are things that I've said today in this presentation that you were like, hard pass, unsubscribe, no thanks, write that down. Go journal about that. Go find a therapist. Go talk to somebody about that. Unpack what's coming up for you. What we know in the mental health field, for those of us that are mental health clinicians, is that when you avoid something, that desire to avoid it becomes stronger. It just keeps getting worse, right? So the more you push that thing to the side, the more damage you're doing to yourself and potentially your clinical practice. Lack of services. How can we expand the services that we have? It's so important to talk about expanding the services and to get additional training. If you are working, especially with a person who is on hormone replacement therapy, it is so, and I'm sure Dr. Kitchen, you can speak to this too. It is so important that you are aware that if someone is on hormone replacement therapy, so testosterone or estrogen, it may not be a good idea for them to be on an SSRI because it literally mimics the same system in the body as a teenager on an SSRI and can kick them into suicidality or irritability or to a place of instability. But many people don't know that. So they just make the assumption, hey, yeah, it's fine. Let's put you on Zoloft, right? So these are things we need to keep in mind. If you're expanding your services because you want to address some of these lack of services, where else do you need to expand your practice in psychopharmacology, in your direct interventions? Thinking about, in particular, addressing laws and policies that may increase discrimination against the queer and BIPOC community. Yes, thank you. And yes, some of the things, oftentimes when we have folks who are experiencing gender dysphoria in particular, that causes depression and anxiety as well. So when we can alleviate the gender dysphoria, oftentimes we can create a great sense of well-being for someone, even if they've experienced trauma. Even still, many of the queer folk that I know and I've worked with have experienced trauma, and when we can relieve that gender dysphoria or alleviate it to some extent, that is so much more powerful, and they're able to address their trauma, they're able to engage in healthy coping skills. Last two slides really quick. So some promising practices. If you're not familiar with the REACH Coalition, we have the REACH Coalition here in San Diego, which is a group of 11 providers now. We have both of the LGBTQ centers in North County and in Central who are a part of the REACH Coalition, as well as we have the Strong-Hearted Native Women's Coalition, who represents our tribal liaison space. We have folks from the task force, we have folks from the DA's office, we have all of these different service providers who come together, and we are talking about not only best practice, we're actually working on finishing our best practice around working with survivors of trafficking of many different identities and different types of interventions. But in particular, we're also talking about and addressing how do we push this forward? How do we continue to have more conversation around how do we make sure that more research happens for the LGBTQIA community? How do we find housing? There is only one mental health program in all of San Diego County that has housing specifically for queer folks. It's called Stepping Stones. It is a substance abuse program. There are 2 housing programs, one for trans youth, and then one for adults who are HIV positive. That's it. If you don't fall into one of those categories, you ain't getting housing in San Diego. This is a big deal, figuring out how to expand these services. If you are just feeling like you want to get involved in the LGBTQIA community in general around issues relating to survivorship, we have the LGBTQIA task force. Feel free to send me an email, maybe send me an email so I can make sure you get connected more easily. I am one of the core members of the LGBTQIA+ task force, and we are a group of folks who identify as survivors of both sexual and relationship violence here in San Diego County, who are also queer identifying, and we are working to increase the competency of providers of all kinds across the county. So we work mental health, medical, school provision, but we also provide programming for the community as well. So we provide community programming for adults, as well as community and prevention-based education for youth as well. So if you're interested in getting involved with that task force, we meet once a month and we do all sorts of fun things. And then lastly, the Project Life Survivor Advisory Board. I won't call anyone out in particular about the Survivor Advisory Board, but we have a Survivor Advisory Board with 8 folks with their own lived experience of exploitation and trafficking, who have various held identities across the board. And that's another space where we're being really intentional about saying, you know what, for example, this whole training was completely reworked and came out of discussions with folks who are queer identifying on our Survivor Advisory Board. It's not quite finished yet. We've still got some different things we want to add to it and adjust. But I say that to say our training is completely different than it was a year ago, specifically because of our Survivor Advisory Board and honest conversations about what is it going to take to help service providers understand the needs of the LGBTQIA+ community. So lastly, call to action. Expand the continuum of care. Expand the continuum of care, right? Just expand the continuum of care, y'all. It's so important, right? Create safe housing if you can for LGBTQIA folks specifically. Examine your shelter and your housing policies if you're someone who either have access to that. I know I heard someone mention being from the Freedom Center, which is absolutely fantastic, right? And exploring like, how do we ensure that our housing and our shelter policies are first of all, are in line with VAWA's non-discrimination guidance. There's a lot of great information under VAWA around that non-discrimination guidance, but also thinking about customizing your treatment plans and your case management plans to the individual. Y'all should be doing that with every person, regardless of their gender identity or sexual orientation. That should happen for every client. That's called trauma-informed care. So just do that always. Do not ask. And you know what I should say? I should take out the do not ask a transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming person. Do not ask a person about their bodies, surgeries, or hormones without a legitimate reason to do so. You do not need to know how someone else has sex. You do not need to know how someone else uses the bathroom or what's going on under their clothes. It's not related at all, unless it's directly related to your treatment plan, right? If you're working with someone on medical transition, okay, it's probably important to know. Have you changed your name legally? Do we need to work on gender markers, right? Those are important things to know. Someone who's going to the gender affirming care clinic at Rady's, those are conversations that are appropriate. Someone's coming to you for their trauma treatment or for case management and housing, you probably don't need to know those things. They might share them with you and that's okay, but you don't necessarily need to know them. Use the know and tell why doctrine. Know why you're asking the question before you do it. And that should be with every client. That's trauma-informed care. That should be with every single client. Know why you're asking that question. And sometimes you're going to explain it first. I want to ask you a couple of questions about your experience of substance use. We ask these questions to all of our clients. It's not something that will make you ineligible for services. We just want to make sure that we get the right fit for you for housing. Did you see how that had nothing to do with that person's gender identity or sexual orientation? Something to that. And lastly, of course, don't create burdensome demands for identity documents, because honestly, like, which human trafficking survivors actually even have documents on them, y'all? Like, nobody. Like even our cis folks don't have that documentation on a regular basis because it's been taken by their traffickers. And lastly, create an ongoing opportunity for training because staff and yourself, because terms change. I'm part of the queer community myself, and I'm frequently like, oh, I didn't know that wasn't, okay, all right, sorry, y'all, right? And it is what it is, and we just move on, and it's not a big deal. But it's important for us to stay tapped into the communities that we're trying to serve so that we can ensure that we're culturally competent to meet their needs. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing this so that I can drop this into the chat. I'm also going to pull up detention numbers really quick so I can drop that into the chat. Questions, comments, concerns, go.
I'm going to real quick ask you, have you worked with Urban Street Angels? Are you familiar with them at all? Excellent.
Yeah. I've actually, one of our past employees used to work there. And so we got connected maybe 3 years ago. So we've had a couple of clients who have gone through Urban Street Angels and really liked it. It's a mixed bag, but I think it's always a mixed bag. I think sometimes in those spaces as we're kind of helping people explore what safety looks like, and kind of figuring out how to advocate for themselves as well, especially when we have so many spaces where folks are also queer identifying and maybe have come to the table and like they haven't dealt with their own stuff. Like I see that on a really regular basis where it's like, oh, like, well, I'm trans, so I can say whatever I want, or I'm gay, so I can grab your boobs, or and like not acknowledging like, no, you still have a responsibility to your own bodily autonomy and ask for consent. But yes, we have, and they have been fantastic in the past.
Excellent. And Anna had a question that, like, if people are more comfortable asking questions if we turn off the recording.
Yeah.
If people have
Totally.
questions now, go ahead, and if not, we'll stop the recording and then we'll continue questions.
Yeah.
Coletta has a raised hand. Do you have a question?
Go for it.
I do. As a medical professional, we're all struggling right now with COVID, with compassion fatigue. It's a real deal. In your work, how the heck do you guys counter that real thing?
Yes, that's a great question. It's a very great question. I don't understand why it will not allow me to drop it in.
Oh, I don't think it allows that with Team or with Zoom.
Okay.
With Teams it will, but we're happy to send those out to everybody.
I'll just resend it to you. Okay, excellent. I'll send you the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So that is a fantastic question. I think so. There are a couple of things that come up for me when I think about this. So the biggest thing, honestly, is we work in a high crisis field. This might sound a little morbid for a second, but it's just the reality. We work in a really high crisis field. We also work in a high fatality field. I've lost clients in the last year to fentanyl, to suicide, to all sorts of things, right? And that's just the reality of the nature of the work that we do. And so sometimes at the end of the day, you have to go to bed and say, nobody died. And those 120 emails I still have sitting in my inbox can wait until tomorrow because I need sleep. So some of it is honestly, first and foremost, one of the things that we've had to really shift for our team. And yes, it is related to compassion fatigue and burnout, but being more specific about setting realistic expectations of what we can handle. Because I think so many of us were operating at that pre-pandemic level, thinking, oh, this is going to be a few months. This is going to be a few months. This is going to be a few months. And I'm like, oh, it's been a year. It's been a year. Oh my God, it's been a year. Oh my God, we're going into 2022. Oh my God, I'm still processing 2020, right? And so I say that to say all of those components at the same time, thinking about those pieces in particular, we had to help our staff shift to a space of saying, what is reasonable and what is a reasonable expectation for you today, right? We don't care about the productivity. We care about healing. We care about keeping you safe. We care about meeting the client's needs. So some of the things that we did as a program in particular is while we do have like requirements for like direct contact productivity, we actually don't even check that stuff anymore because we know that people are working their butts off. We know that even if they're not meeting that, I don't care if somebody's at 30% this week because they might be at 75% the next week. I don't really care. I just want them to care for themselves. In addition to that, things that we've done specifically as a program and an agency is, of course, we've done things like having like COVID days off. Like in the month of October, we all got a day off where people just, September, we're in October now. People in September had an opportunity to take a COVID day off, which is just a paid day off. We've done that a couple of times. We've done some financial bonuses as well for folks to help cover the cost of like internet and increased electricity and things like that. But I think some of the biggest things that we've been doing more recently in the last, I would say 6 months in particular, because I've seen that big shift in the last 6 months to that space of like, oh my God, just like extreme despair and exhaustion, to move to the space of being honest. Thank you. Appreciate it. Just being honest about what's going on. Hey, I had a really crappy week this week. I'm exhausted. What's your oxygen mask this week? We ask that question almost every week in group supervision. What's your oxygen mask, right? We always give that analogy when you're in the airplane and they say, put your oxygen mask on first. They say that because if the air pressure changes in the cabin and you put the oxygen mask on your 3-year-old and then the cabin air pressure changed, your 3-year-old is breathing, but now they have an unconscious parent. That's not terrifying at all, right? As opposed to you put your oxygen mask on first, maybe the pressure changes and you can put it on your child while they're passed out. But the point being, if you're not caring for yourself first, you cannot care for someone else. And so that's where we stay almost every day. What's your oxygen mask today? How are you caring for yourself? And a lot of that has had to be a culture shift and a change in how we support each other, and a movement away from the idea of what's that bottom line productivity, we got to get it done mentality, to what's the most important thing today. And so I think the self-care components, like all of those things are great and they're so important and they're so needed. Don't get me wrong, they absolutely are important, and you absolutely want to, find your own groove, especially as you start to do trauma treatment and trauma work with folks, right? You want to find your own groove of how you care for yourself. But I say all of that to say, it's also at the same time like we're trying to bail the Titanic out with a thimble, right? So like, I mean, you could do all the self-care you want. It's not going to change the fact that there's a global pandemic, right? That there's all sorts of like crazy racial trauma that's just like popping up in people's faces that has been, hidden behind the curtain for years for some folks and not for others. So the ocean was on fire a month ago. We have a giant oil spill in Orange County now, right? Like these are all things that they're just one after the other after the other. And so self-care is important, but it's only going to do so much. So radical acceptance also has to be part of the key of saying like, y'all, this stuff is messed up. And how am I going to get through it?
Kay, to your point, and thank you. That was very authentic. Sharp is working on a trauma-informed care continuing ed series, and as one of those modules is on vicarious trauma. And please take advantage of that because it is multidisciplinary. So for your team, for all healthcare systems, and for all stakeholders in the community, and you're on mute now. I don't know if you knew that.
No, sorry, I was just getting really excited. I was like, ooh, yeah.
Yeah, so we want to make sure that we're helping people with their continuing ed as well as giving them that skill set. Mm-hmm. So feel free to take advantage and refer to it for people as a means of support.
Yeah, that is awesome. I really love that. I think too, like things like that are really important, because I think the other piece that we found is that when there are spots like that, so not just that it's a webinar that someone's watching, but when there's a space to create a sense of community around the struggle, that also really helps with that with that compassion fatigue and burnout of just being somebody else being able to say like, I see you, I hear you, I'm where you're at, or I was there last week and I'm doing good this week. Because that's the other thing, right? Is remembering like you can fluctuate. Some weeks you'll be fine and other weeks you won't be. And so finding that community space to be able to lean into people who are like, yeah, I'm really struggling this week too. And like, I feel you, or I was struggling last week. So this week, like, I got you. I'll stay on an extra hour and take care of that for you. I'll respond to that phone call. I got you is another piece as well that we've seen a lot with our staff.
I call it the upswings. When the numbers go down a little bit, we'll have a few weeks where we can actually laugh again, and then it goes away.
Yeah, my partner is in the hospital system as well, and so he was actually doing surge staffing when the pandemic started, which he actually had to leave because that was too traumatic to basically every day see a list of people who are no longer on this earth because of the virus that were staff members. Yeah, so I hear that absolutely. I mean, it's crazy. I just wanted to drop these in here for you too really quick. These are the detention numbers. 222.
And then I just wanted to ask again, if you have a question that you're not comfortable asking by just chatting with Kay directly, in the chat, or if you want us to wait until after we stop recording, just say something in the chat and we'll go ahead and hit stop.
And this right here, I will actually drop this into the slides that I'll send so you all have a copy of it, but just to show you, these are the numbers on the regional stats for the state of California around detention of LGBTQIA youth. So you can see it broken down based on region as to the number of folks, the percentages of youth in those regions that are identifying within those identities. 12% of boys and 51% of girls. So I'll make sure that I drop that in there as well so that you have access to those numbers. But those are the most current, and I believe that's through, I think this is the 2015 or 2016 study, if I remember correctly. That actually came through the court system itself. So I will send that with you as well, but just so you can see that.
Thanks. And then like with your what you're talking about with the continuum of consent, I saw an article, and we'll include this in the minutes, but I just put it in the chat about it has to be their choice, and like a very trauma-informed way of approaching where they're at and having that discussion. So we'll include that in the minutes.
Absolutely. And I think, that being their choice and thinking about that component of, whether folks identify as a survivor or not, because I think we all struggle with, finding ways with the folks we work with of making sure that they are able to get to that place where they can acknowledge their victimization so that they can heal. I think there's this really interesting component, and exactly what you're saying there, of the reality that someone doesn't have to identify as a victim to access services of any kind, but how do we reframe this conversation so that it doesn't have to be based on their victimization in order for them to access housing, right? I see you've experienced these things. You know what? Let me refer you to this provider. It's not uncommon that folks have experienced sexual exploitation when they've been homeless, and you don't have to share your experience with me, but I'd really like for you to be able to talk to this provider and see if, maybe anything comes up. I don't think I shared it in here. I shared it in another presentation I did this morning, but I had someone recently reach out to me who is a very high-ranking official in the agency that they work for. And they sent me and my executive director an email asking if one of my very close friends, who is also the executive director of an agency here in San Diego, who is also openly queer, if they were a survivor of human trafficking. They have zero background or like evidence for saying that beyond that they were like, oh, I remember I met them at this event, blah, 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 blah. I've done a couple things with them. Are they a victim of human trafficking? Because they're queer? I mean, this person does share their experience of being a homeless youth and engaging in survival sex, but they do not identify as a victim of trafficking. That is not part of their story, and that's absolutely okay, right? This person is doing really well. They're the executive director of a nonprofit in San Diego. They're doing pretty good these days, right? So it's not like they need those types of services, but I say that to say that was literally a very high-ranking public official making an assumption like that. So when that's kind of the norm, how do we tackle those issues so that it's not about someone saying, yes, I was victimized, in order to be able to access the services they need for well-being?
I have a question that's more of an abstraction, and you may or may not have an answer to this.
I love your questions, Amy. They're always very philosophical in nature sometimes. Yeah. I love them.
So a lot of what you delivered tonight is the marginalization of these populations, and how that lack of family or community support creates situations where historically we've seen this as deviant behavior, but it's been caused by society, really.
Yeah.
So the more that we get to inclusion and less traumatizing these individuals, do you see that making this happen less to these marginalized people?
Yes and no. So I think when we look at experiences of marginalization to the queer community, and we kind of really like examine things at its core and how those are related, a lot of those things are actually rooted in white supremacy and colonization themselves, right? And how we understand gender, even in the US, how gender existed prior to colonization, and even kind of throughout all of the Americas, North, South, Central America as well, how gender manifested through indigenous cultures. It was very common to have more than one gender. It was more than common for folks to have, relationships that were the same sex, or polyamorous relationships, with some people also consider polyamory to be part of the queer community as well. And so I say that to say, I think the interesting rhetoric between the dichotomy of how colonization perpetuated white supremacy to say, this is what gender should look like, this is what sexuality should look like, this is what the micro family should look like, began the process of perpetuating that pervasive marginalization. And so I think there's absolutely always an opportunity for us to move forward into spaces of equality. And I do see those things happen in some ways. However, I don't think that these issues will ever fully be entirely addressed until both providers and systemically, but especially as providers, we really kind of lean into that anti-racism work and how that impacts how we understand also sexuality and gender, because the two things are not mutually exclusive, and they have been very rooted in white supremacy and colonization in particular. There's a really fascinating book called Sex at Dawn. I think that's what it's called. It's a sociology book about the experiences of sexuality like throughout history, and kind of talking about different perspectives of how sexual identity and gender have been formed, and sexual relationships through also patriarchy and colonization and monogamy, and these different components and how those are related. But I say that to say, like, I think it's a yes, and I think, yes, there definitely will be opportunities where this is happening less. I think about the kiddos that I work with, that like, I work with kids sometimes who are like, they call me a yelder, which means that you are a young elder in the queer community. So I am a yelder. I'm not sure how I feel about that. But anyways, all that to say, working with youth who are like 11 and they're like transitioning and they're like, oh my God, Kay, I love you so much. You're so great. You have so much wisdom. And I'm like, what? There's no way I could have done that when I was 11. So like, I see them, and even though they may be struggling, like they're out and loud and proud in ways that I never could have been. I couldn't even come out as non-binary until about 2 years ago when my last sibling turned 18. That's what I was waiting for. Because if I had come out, aside from professionally, my family doesn't really care about what I do professionally, but if I had come out in a personal space to my family, I would have lost access to my siblings, because I grew up in a very conservative Southern Baptist home. So I say that to say, like, I see things changing rapidly so much already, because the laws are changing, because attitudes are changing, because people are not being bystanders anymore, because they're not being complacent with the system. And so I think it's a yes and to both, but I think it's definitely a long conversation that many people are not quite ready to have, because many people still aren't ready to have the anti-racism conversation. They're just like, oh, George Floyd, and they don't even want to think about how that actually impacts every aspect of their life. So yeah.
Thanks. Anna dropped that link in there. And I was thinking more of like the transactional relationships.
Ooh, what is this? I'm getting all excited with all the books that Imperial Leather. Oh, I'm gonna have to read that one.
So yeah.
We should start a book club.
We should start a book club. We should have like a Zotero account for like all of these intersections, so that we can, share them. Yeah.
Yeah. Emily's in.
All right. Kay, you're amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks for just being authentic and accessible, and for everything that you do. We really appreciate you.
I think it's one of those things, right? You just want to, I don't ever want anyone to go through the things I've seen my clients go through. So the more the more we can be transparent about what our experiences look like, the more we can create empathy and action and change. So I appreciate you all being here because it's a Wednesday at 7:45 and it's a Wednesday. I mean, for me, this is just like my normal Wednesday. I'm just like, oh, cool. I'm just going to do a presentation in my bedroom. But I don't care.
Oh, we appreciate you.
Amazing. Well, again, thank you so much, Kay. And if you guys haven't yet, please fill out our card for Kay. It's in the chat. I'll repost it really quick in case anyone missed it earlier. There we go. But yeah, this was absolutely incredible, Kay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kay.
Thank you. And please reach out if you have any questions, comments, especially about trauma books. Coletta, I've got so many books. So many books. And I didn't even bother to get into like the mental health components of like the number of trans and non-binary clients who have dissociative identity disorder, often being misdiagnosed as things like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. There's so many things. So yes.
Well, if you don't mind an email from me, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, reach out.
Thank
Definitely.
you.
I'll send you what I've got. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Coletta's part of our SHARP Equality Alliance at SHARP.
Oh,
We've
nice.
recently implemented standards of care for LGBTQI individuals.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so we're moving forward in a good direction.
Yeah, and I mean, again, right, like that's that nested system, right? Creating those policies that just say, this is how we do things. This is who we are as an organization, which eventually comes to this is who we are as a county, which comes to who we are as a state and a nation. So, I mean, that's how we shift it.
Right, and in making sure that we're inclusive of gender minorities also moves us toward being a trauma-informed care organization.
Yes, absolutely.
So we're doing what we can. So thanks for being a part of that. And I know that you feel strongly about creating safe spaces for these individuals. And so if people want to be a part of that process, is it okay if they reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know, Amy and I were talking the other day by email, and I was just sharing that there are kind of a core group of us in the mostly queer identifying, but not all queer identifying, that just acknowledge the reality that, like for the center, as an example, both of the centers do have free counseling services, but they're often geared towards very specific things like you are HIV positive. And so your counseling is around supporting you in your HIV diagnosis, or you are in your transition, or you have experienced intimate partner violence specifically, right? But part of the struggle with all of those things is like, what about the queer kid who's 17 that's just like, I'm just kind of depressed. Like, oh, so maybe I'll use the substance instead to self-medicate instead of finding other skills, right? Instead of finding other ways to be. And so we've been having conversations about the reality that we don't have kind of a comprehensive wellness center that's available to the queer community here in San Diego. And so we've been talking about what that might look like to, whether that's an outpatient mental health space or also a community-based space where people can say, hey, like I'm a two-spirit person. I want to rent out the community room so I can do some traditional practices with my other two-spirit folks, or even show other people what we do. Like, cool, sure, great. It's on us, right?
Right. And Haley, you're with Planned Parenthood, right?
That's right.
Great. When my brother came out when he was 15, he was part of teen council, and then he volunteered for several years afterward. It was a lifeline for him, and it was a proactive program focused on healthy and safe relationships, and we really need more of that.
Yeah, I'm representing here tonight the care coordination program. So Planned Parenthood, at least of the Pacific Southwest area, really trying to expand our social services alongside our medical services, and hopefully eventually into behavioral health services. So we're excited to kind of move in that direction. Yeah.
Ooh,
that's great.
I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Good.
Planned Parenthood is my favorite.
And I think that we need to make sure that we're all collaborating on that, not siloing everything.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we have overlapping services so that people have, in different geographical areas and on all of that. So thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Kay.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. Planned Parenthood's just pushing it forward. They're like, whatever, federal government, we're going to make it happen no matter what. You're the best.
Politics ebbs and flows, and hopefully people are just getting taken care of.
Planned Parenthood just persists. They got it. That's my 4-year-old niece's favorite. I persisted. She gets really excited about it. Somebody bought her a book about the Elizabeth Warren speech, and now that's all she says. I persisted. It was really difficult, Kay, but I persisted. All right,
That's right.
cool beans.
It's a
You
great
did, girl.
mantra.
It's great. It's great.
Yeah.
All righty.
Well, awesome. We'll send out the minutes next week likely, and also send out the slides from Kay. But yeah, no, this was fantastic.
And we'll upload this to the YouTube channel so that you can share it with your colleagues.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate the conversation. Amazing questions. This was lovely.
Thanks for having us. It was fabulous.
Glad to have you.
Take care,
And
everybody.
yeah, enjoy the rest of your evenings, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Emily.
Bye. Thank
Guys.
you.
Thank you.
Amy, isn't that the worst part about being sick in the pandemic, though? You're like, I have a cold, but